No one can say precisely when this land erupted out of the sea. Certainly it was volcanic activity that etched out this lunar-like landscape, rugged, stark, awesome. These are the high regions of a South Pacific island, a place called Tanna. The volcanoes that brought it into this world about 2 million years ago now form part of a mysterious, majestic mountain range. In parts, it's more than 1,000 meters high. There is one volcano which doesn't sleep. Ever restless, it bubbles away, spewing forth ashes and smoke. But the threat of eruption is of little concern to the islanders who live in its shadow. You see, they've had to contend with an even less predictable threat, the European. Tanna is one of the 80 islands which make up the Vanuatu group, formerly known as the New Hebrides. For a few thousand years, the people who migrated here in their large canoes led relatively simple lives. They lived off the land, making full use of the natural resources. The pace is still slow. Seemingly little has changed. But that's not quite true. Round about the middle of the last century, the peace of the Pacific was well and truly disturbed. The European arrived. Of course, such a development is not unique to Tanna, but more than any other peoples in the island group, the Tannese fiercely resisted outside interference. Nevertheless, they became the victims of repression, disease, exploitation, and an inept colonial-type administration. Vanuatu in the southwest Pacific and part of Melanesia was first discovered by Spanish explorer de Quiros in 1606. It took him months and months to get there. Today you can fly to one of the main islands, Efate, in about 3 hours out of Sydney, Australia.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just commenced our descent into Vila, 95 nautical miles out at the moment. Off to the right-hand side of the aircraft, 90 miles abeam of the southern islands of the Vanuatu chain. On behalf of the entire crew, I trust you have enjoyed the flight with us. Thank you.
To get to Tanna, one of the most southerly islands in the chain, there's a change of plane at Port Vila, the capital. It was from Vila that the French and British jointly administered the then New Hebrides from 1906. They bumbled along until independence was granted in 1980. Then the group took on its new name, Vanuatu, meaning the land that rose out of the sea.
Off, ice flexion off, flight ground, switch ground. Swerve off, start switches off.
About 100 kilometers south of Efate lies Erromango, and further south again, Tanna. 51 kilometers long, 24 kilometers across. Population, about 17,000. This was the course set by British navigator Captain James Cook when he discovered Tanna in 1774. Although de Quiros and Frenchman Bougainville had sighted the group before him, it was Cook who charted the islands and named them the New Hebrides. Cook crisscrossed the Pacific in the 460-ton ship, the Resolution, and his crew experienced few problems until they landed on Erromango. They were met with a shower of stones and arrows. The British seamen replied with musket fire. 2 natives were killed. Cook gladly set sail for the island to the south, guided, he wrote, by the great fire we saw upon it. He was, of course, heading for Tanna. The Resolution anchored off the island overnight. Later they moored in an inlet which Cook named Resolution Bay. Along the shoreline were undeniable signs of habitation. It was then that Cook realized that what he had taken for a fire was, in fact, Tanna's active volcano, Yasur. If Cook was worried by the situation following the skirmish on Erromango, the islanders must have been out of their minds. This was the first time they had set eyes on white men. Contact was made between the two parties. Gifts were exchanged. The islanders grew bolder in their approaches. One displayed his rear end in an act of defiance. Another tried to carry off the British ensign. Whether they had quickly ascertained that the British were mere mortals of a different hue, we'll probably never know. However, it does seem to dispel the notion that they thought they were dealing with their own white ghosts. In his log, Cook wrote that the islanders were cannibals. He described them as being slender, with good features, and excelling in the use of arms, but not fond of labor. Of the women, he said, "I cannot say they are beauties, but handsome enough for the men, and too handsome for the use that is made of them." Of their first landing on Tanna, one crew member observed, "They did not insult us, 'tis true, but they did by no means seem reconciled to the liberty we took in landing upon their coasts." One wonders if Cook realized what he had started. The Europeans who would follow him would be taking more than just liberties on this coastline. For 50 years after Cook's departure, no one gave Tanna a second thought, until, that is, sandalwood was discovered on the islands. And for the next 50 years after that, there was a procession of traders who came for their pickings. They were unscrupulous in their dealings with the islanders. Fear and distrust on both sides led to bloody clashes. Many natives were killed. Crews were massacred and eaten. Well-intentioned missionaries arrived in the wake of the traders. Like so many who brought their good books to the Pacific, they came ill-prepared. Initially, they used Polynesian teachers to spread the word, but language and environment were barriers to them too. The badly trained novices and their missionary mentors were either held captive, put to flight, even clubbed to death. However, the missionaries' greatest enemy wasn't the pagan black. It was the continual epidemic outbreak of white man's diseases. Islanders died in their thousands. Not without some justification, the islanders blamed the white missionaries and their new god. The authoritarian yet courageous Presbyterians would eventually get a firm foothold, but it was achieved at great cost. More missionaries died in the line of duty in Vanuatu than in any other Pacific region. As a result of a long series of atrocities and epidemics, the population of the islands diminished rapidly. Another contributing factor was blackbirding. Of the 40,000 who were recruited or abducted to work on the sugar plantations of Australia and Fiji, 10,000 never returned home. In 1888, the trader, the Fijian, en route to Fiji with Indian labor, went aground in Tanna waters. The sunken wreck is still there, only meters below the surface. is a chilling reminder of the dreadful fate of its cargo. The crew, however, managed to scramble ashore and with the help of a missionary made a timely escape from the hands of hungry locals. Also on board was a shipment of mynah birds being sent to Fiji to rid the plantations of insects. Their cages broke open and they flew to safety. A new, but thankfully a harmless species, was established on Tanna. If there was one white man who would not unsettle Tanna, it was Australian-born Bob Paul. He worked on the inter-island trading boats shortly after the Second World War. The trade was copra, shell, and still fetching a price, sandalwood. Paul bought his own boat in 1948. This latter-day trader based himself in Vila, where a deputation of islanders from Tanna paid him an uncharacteristic visit.
They had a letter written in Fijian to me asking me could I come down to Tanna and open up there.
From what we know of the traders and latterly the planters on Tanna, that was a rare offer indeed. However, on arrival, Paul found that those very people resented competition from outsiders.
I found all the roads were blocked to me. They dropped trees across roads, they put barbed wire fences across roads, all this sort of thing. I wasn't allowed to go on the beaches. In fact, I was threatened with a gun by one fella. And there's not good anchorage there, and I wanted to pull my boat ashore, and they wouldn't let me get it pulled up on the land there. And while we were still arguing, we had a tidal wave. I ended up 150 yards inside his plantation. So I got the boat ashore anyway. I think the difference between us and the usual type of people and our predecessors and the many people we saw come and go was we made Tanna our home. We were prepared to live there forever. And we saw lots of people come in and make a fast buck on the copper and take their money away, and you never heard of them again. But we completely identified ourselves with the place, and our kids grew up there, our kids grew up with the people there, and you can't help but get interested in it.
Okay. Today, Bob Paul's son Russell runs the store his father established more than 30 years ago.
Okay, good. Okay.
The store is still the only one of significance trading on the island. In the early days when Bob Paul was running the show, he was responsible for introducing much of the modern-day world to Tanna.
We introduced the first bank in the islands. They didn't know what a bank was. They couldn't understand it. So they'd put their money in the bank. Next day they'd come and take it all out again to see if it was still there.
Although Tanna now has a cash economy, a bank would appear to be of low priority. As yet, there is little opportunity for employment. There is the market, which gathers early morning once a week. Villagers from all over, some walking all night to get there, bring in their produce. Roles haven't changed since Cook was here. The women are still stuck with the chores. They do the growing and the selling. Trading is carried out virtually in the shade of the Paul store at Lenakel, which really is the commercial centre. Has the Paul clan cashed in on the island trade? Well, it can be said of the Pauls, at least they have the distinction of being asked to settle on Tanna. Quite arbitrarily, other enterprises came and went, making little contribution to the welfare of the locals. The Pauls are the biggest employers of labour. Islanders work in the store and on unloading cargo from the boats, which on average call every 2 weeks. Apart from the occasional tourist and the mail, which are transported by light aircraft from Vila, anything and everything is brought to Tanna this way, as it has been for well over a century. There's been no harbour here since 1878, when Yasur erupted and raised the island, making Port Resolution inaccessible to deep-water ships. And if Bob Paul never got round to building a wharf, he was instrumental in setting up the first radio telephone, known here as the Taem phone. Undoubtedly, improved communication links would have been welcomed by his old adversaries. Yet, the importation of a truck rekindled hostility.
When I took up the present place I'm in, I bought myself a truck. I bought a native driver, a fellow named Frem. It was the first time they'd seen a local person driving, and there was an uproar among these traders that went there, that the roads were no longer safe with a black man driving on the road. They all went up to the district agent with a petition that the place was no longer safe. The district agent said, well, he's got a licence, he can drive. And they made life hell for that fellow. They used to run at him with cars and try and run him off the road, try to get an excuse to do it. And he never ever bent a mud guard, he never did a thing wrong. He was a better driver than all of them. We brought in such things as ice creams. Never seen ice cream. The first ice cream we handed out to people, they wondered what it was, and they'd take a lick of it and they'd drop it like a hot scone. They'd never seen anything frozen before.
If an ice cream should have aroused such amazement, one begins to understand what effect things like refrigerators must have had. Islanders carried all sorts of cargo straight into the white man's store, which, outwardly, he didn't pay for. Would they be receiving such gifts one day? Well, that's what they came to believe. Cargo cults sprang up round the Pacific. To visitors, who aren't exactly welcome here, it looks much like any other village on Tanna. But it is different. It is a well-run, close-knit community that keeps itself to itself. It's the headquarters of the John Frum cargo cult. Who's John Frum? Well, he's a bit of a mystery. In 1941, an islander claimed he had been visited by a man calling himself John Frum. He said Frum instructed the Tannese to rid themselves of the Europeans and to destroy the things which they'd given them. Frum would then send shiploads of gifts to the island. The Tannese were obviously ready for such promises. Within days, the missions were deserted. Money was literally thrown into the sea. The district agent, edgy about a possible uprising, imprisoned cult leaders, but the movement, which was to become anti-white, anti-mission, and anti-government, had taken root. A year later, the war in the Pacific helped to further entrench the cult. Bob Paul explains.
In 1942, the American fleet arrived in Vila, and they needed labour to build the airfield. They sent a Liberty ship down to Tanna and recruited about 1,000 Tannese. They took them to Vila. They worked on the aerodrome and they saw all the American stuff, the equipment they had, the aeroplanes, the trucks, the refrigerators, the whole thing that goes with an army. And they're absolutely staggered, and that's when John Frum became they said he must be an American. That's cargo.
The Red Cross sign became the cult's sacred symbol. It was adopted after an islander returned home, after being exiled for his part in the movement. He said Frum had told him the cross signified that there would be a second coming, and that he would bring with him the gifts he is said to have promised. But there's nothing much wrong with the John Frum movement and its faithful followers, says Government Representative Joe Joseph.
When I was a boy, actually, I found out that John Frum movement is one of the very good movement on the island. And when it started, because what happened that you find people who've been involved in that movement, they're really a very, I would say, a very good people who are honest, they're very helpful, they share idea, and they help the people in the village. Somebody had told them in a dream that in the future, you will govern yourself, you will have your own independence, you will have planes flying to your country, to your island, you will have ice boxes on the island, you will have big roads, you will have trucks, which people never dream of it. But John Frum had promised them, in the future, those things will come to your island.
You could say some of those dreams have come true. The islanders do have their independence, yet modern facilities on Tanna are still few in number. Independence hasn't affected the John Frum lifestyle. There's little evidence of Western comforts. There's one tap, and there are vestiges of a colonial influence, cricket and volleyball. The village owns the land upon which Yassur stands. It derives monies from tourists visiting the volcano. There are many widely differing beliefs surrounding the mythical John Frum. Some claim to have met him. Others have recurring visions. One story tells of a time when John Frum will appear out of the crater riding a Harley-Davidson motorbike, followed by 5,000 of his soldiers. Another story suggests there are thousands of devils down in that furnace, forging weapons in anticipation of his arrival. According to Bob Paul, these stories are quite simply journalistic beat-ups.
The original story of the volcano, how it came about, was two women, one Moonga and one Sanga. The Sanga was from South Tanna and Moonga from that area where the volcano is. And Sanga was her old friend, and she called on her after not having seen her for so long, and she was so pleased to see her, she had to cook a lap-lap. And they cook in the stones there, and she built an enormous fire in her excitement and to heat the stones up, and such a big fire that burnt through the ground, and they both fell down into the ground. And that the fire's still going. That's almost fire, and they're still down there. And there's volcanic tubes come out around the ash plain area there, long volcanic tubes, and that's where Moonga and Sanga come out and sees a man every now and then. If ever anyone disappears in Tanna, they're quite certain that Moonga's got him.
In recent years, the sacred crosses have been taken down on the instructions of the government. That the village agreed to their removal suggests a less aggressive stance. Although belief may still be strong, the movement is losing its influence. Today, the only outward show of strength is the weekly sing-along. The 300-odd villagers lead a completely separate lifestyle. The children are not sent to school. It is believed that their saviour will not only bring trucks and cars, washing machines, fridges and Coca-Cola, but he will also provide education. But how long will all this take to arrive?
Sam Takuma, he's dead now. He was from Lonely Lapin Village when he was being interviewed by David Attenborough. David Attenborough said, "You've been waiting 19 years for John Frum to come, isn't that a long time?" And he said, "You've been waiting for 2,000 years for Jesus Christ." He said, "We can wait."
European, John Frum must come across as a fantasy born out of primitive minds. But think about this. How would primitive white man have responded if a Rolls-Royce pulled up outside his cave? Would he have seen it as some magical force to be revered? John Frum, it would seem, evolved as an antidote to European intruders who deprived the islanders of what they considered was rightly theirs. And don't we all, in some form or other, whether it be spiritual or material, have our own John Frums? In contrast to the John Frum lifestyle, there are those islanders who live as they have done for thousands of years. In the custom village, they perpetuate the traditional way of life. It wasn't always that way. At the turn of the century, the Presbyterians all but controlled life on the island. They banned many customs, the very essence of island culture. Not until the late 50s did the church relax the impositions. The people of the custom village now work, live and play without hindrance in a bid to regain some of their lost heritage.
In the custom villages, you find people usually sit at Nakamal to tell stories, the old stories, tell them customs, how they put on the custom. For example, if marriage feast, how would they perform it? Or toka dancing, how they do it? And sort of circumcision ceremony, how they do it. They're just passing on to the people, tell them stories, and they keep passing it all the time. It's nothing written down. And I think one thing that which is very good to Tanna is they have to keep it.
It has been said that the custom religion is on this world, but not of it. It defies description. According to custom, men were never alone on this world. Through land, they were linked to their ancestors. They had their ghosts, their spirits, and magic too. It is believed that people of the West Solomons settled on Tanna about 2,500 years ago. During colonization, the new arrivals formed into small clans. Today, there are hundreds of hamlets spread throughout Tanna. Neighbouring clans weren't always neighbourly. They did form alliances, however. The method for establishing good relations was to stage gift-giving ceremonies. The most notable is the Toka feast. A mass of food is prepared for the feast, which is held every 6 or 7 years. Clans get together and invite another group to join in a 4-day ritual, a highlight of which is dancing. The Toka is the island's grandest affair, which takes the best part of a year to prepare. It strictly follows custom. The dances are rehearsed in secret and new songs specially written. It is a unique occasion and takes place only when the chiefs believe they're rich enough to hold such an event. Thousands from all over the island come to be part of the Toka. During the festival, dancing continues for 2 days, with both groups, the hosts and the visitors, contributing to the show. As if to throw out a challenge to the volcano, the sound of dancing feet beating the ground can be heard for miles around. A procession of dances by men, women, and children eventually gives way to the gift-giving ceremonies. Ostensibly, the exchange of pigs is the most important part in this festival of friendship. At the most recent toka, 100 pigs were involved. About 60 were slaughtered. As the pigs are exchanged, the chiefs keep a watchful eye. An equal exchange must be seen to be done. The Tannese will continue to reassert their identity with the preservation of custom. As part of an independent nation, hopefully they can now determine their own future without the conflicting directives of a British and French administration. Vanuatu eventually got its independence in 1980. It didn't come without its troubles. There were riots. Tanna didn't miss out. Secessionist rebels took matters into their own hands and kidnapped government representative Joe Joseph. Bob Paul got caught up in the shootout.
Ours was the only radio left on the island that wasn't in rebel hands. We got a message to Vila, and before dawn, when the aircraft were just arriving, the airfield was blown up. And we managed to keep the aircraft encircling while we filled in the holes. And women were carrying soil in their skirts to fill it in, and we filled in 19 big holes in the airfield. The British mobile police marched up the middle bush, led by Ian Cook, and broke up the rebels. And Joe Joseph escaped in the fire while the fighting was going on.
A number of rebels were captured and imprisoned. When supporters came to their aid, another shootout developed. One of the captured was shot dead. Joe Joseph survived the uprising. So did independence. Vanuatu was a nation for the first time.
Okay, over now. Okay.
No one believes the future will be easy for the Republic.
Before independence, British and French have been giving them all free education and free medical and all that. And it really gives my people wrong impression that they don't have to work because somebody else will give them what they need. And then when we set up this, we have to tell them that you have to rely on yourself, you have to find money, you have to work, and then to get money to help yourself.
Tourism could be one way to stimulate the economy. The number of tourists visiting Tanna is still relatively small, despite the light aircraft link with Vila. It was set up by Bob Paul. As he recalls, the first landing on the jungle strip was quite an event for all concerned.
Well, we bounced about 200 yards and we cleared down the strip. And there's these thousands of people and they're just silent, just completely overwhelmed. And they just looked at us. I do feel a certain responsibility in this matter of tourism because we started tourism in Vanuatu through bringing the aircraft to Tanna, starting the airline from Tanna. But what I don't want to see is what's happened in Bali. We've got a complete breakdown of the whole social structure. I don't want to see Tanna turn into a place full of motels and hot dog stands and places to try and entertain tourists.
The volcano is one of the main attractions. It is one of the most accessible in the world, taking only about an hour or so to climb to the crater's edge. Tourists wanting mod cons won't find them on Tanna. Not yet, anyway. But what Tanna lacks in modern facilities, it makes up in natural beauty. Tanna is recognized as the most attractive of all the islands in the Vanuatu group.
We had a lot of tourists down here, and they're really giving money to the bus drivers. They're helping to go to the hotels or bungalows or restaurant. If everything is localized, then the money will go to the people. You get more tourists, they will visit the volcano, they have to pay the entrance, and the people from that area, they will benefit from it. I think somewhere in the world today you could hardly find a volcano like this one here. And I think this one is a very attractive one, Taem one I call it. Therefore we have to let it open for the people to come and have a look at it. And then pay money to the landowners. And they're really getting a lot of money from it.
I like a tourist, my friend. He came here, he give little money to me, I pay August night for walking garden. Every country, I like every country. Sweden, Germany, America, Australia, France, England. I like it. One is not coming here, Russia.
Right through the time when I was running tourism, I never took people to villages, only to the volcano, to wild horses and general tours.
Horses, originally imported by the missionaries, now roam free across a deserted plateau. This region, which supports a fern known as white grass, has become the refuge of several hundred wild horses. But wild horses certainly aren't going to drag in tourists in their thousands. To do that, you've got to provide the accommodation and facilities today's tourists have come to expect. In other words, you must join the chase for the tourist dollar. Is it worth it? It's a proposition the Tannese must evaluate carefully. For once tourist development begins in a substantial way, it will be difficult to apply the brake.
The social impact of tourism is something that's got to be very, very carefully controlled. And no, I don't think there's a future in it, a big future in it. I don't say stop it, but I don't think there's a big future in it for the Tanna because actual tourism only affects the airline, the people who are running the tour buses, the tour agents, and the few people who get a royalty on who own the volcano.
The day education is coming and more people going out overseas training, and then they come back with all the different ideas, and they seem to forget a custom. But we have to leave some people back in the villages who keep holding that custom. So I think that if they continue sending their children to school, they never tell them customs, our custom will drop down.
Right, have you turned to that page 1? And exercise 1, that is to write figures or to write in words the numbers that we have made, okay? Right.
No, I think their future lies in what they're good at. They're farmers. The Tannies are the best gardeners in the whole of the Vanuatu. They turn out magnificent products, and that's where they should go back on the land. They've got a lot of land, and good land. This is the most fertile island in the whole group. There's a lot of copper on the ground not being made. There's money in copper. There's coffee. Coffee falls on the ground, and they've got. I think it's up to the administration to tell the people, go back to what you're good at and get back on the land.
In the past, we only had one production in the country is copra. We find out that copra couldn't really go well with this weather. Because of this new scheme they had been produced with the new copra trier, and it's very expensive for the local people to afford. And then we decided to produce coffee. And I think it's also one of the good things to help people with their income. And it's cheaper to grow it actually, and to grow very quickly and produce more fruit. And what we are really trying to do now is trying to set up the big machine here to grind coffee, and then we start probably in about 2 years' time, we start producing coffee from this island. But as one of the representatives, I think I had some ideas that I can pass it to the people to understand the situation, today's situation, and they have to get themselves fit for the changes that are coming today. And I'm really working very hard in it, and I wish Tanna to cooperate together and to send the children to school. And this is the only way to get the island developed, to get the country cooperate with other people and the villages, and the chiefs must cooperate with other people. And this is my really main purpose that I'm really trying to get in develop into the people today in this island.
Over a period of 150 years, the Tannies have come to know European attitudes the hard way. They were thrown into the 20th century and are now obliged to adopt many of white man's ways. There isn't an alternative. There's no turning back. They must work for an independent future, which sees an imported culture sitting comfortably alongside the custom way of life. And they, alone, must be responsible for its success.
I'd just like to say a few words in Pidgin for my friends on Tanna. I'll get up me stop in Australia, me long way long you fella, but heart me stop yet on Tanna. You me got plenty good time, you me got plenty bad time, 30 year you me stop one place, or some one family no more. But you fella, you look out good long old family blue fella, look out good long old Piccaninny blue fella. And all big man, we tell him, you fella, you must wise, or some you fella independent now. You got plenty something you come out, but you fella must wise, you look out good, where you no change, and custom blue fella. Custom you must strong.
In 1994, Australia overtook Cuba to become the largest exporter of raw sugar in the world. The product of the Queensland cane mills earns nearly $2 billion a year for the nation. It's no secret that the sugar industry of the Caribbean was founded on the labour of African slaves. But few Australians have been told how their own sugar industry was created, by the sweat of men and women enticed or kidnapped by force from the islands of the South Pacific. Thousands of them died, and their unmarked graves now lie beneath the cane fields of North Queensland. But in the minds of their descendants, their memories live on.
This is the final boarding call for Air Vanuatu flight NF22 to Port Vila. Your plane is now ready for boarding.
Joe and Monica Leo are embarking on a journey to recover a small portion of a stolen past.
Hey, Mrs. Leo, enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
There, sir. Have a good trip.
Thank you.
100 years ago, Joe Leo's grandfather and Monica's father were transported by white men across this same ocean. Not away from Australia, but towards it, from an island far to the east. They travelled not as passengers, but as cargo, in the dark hold of a trader's ship. They were kidnapped from the tiny island of Pentecost, in what is now the Pacific nation of Vanuatu. The last stage of their long journey is the track which takes them and their children to the village of Lagatoa, where Monica's father was born more than a century ago. The villagers of Lagatoa have never set eyes on Monica Leo, but for weeks they've been preparing to welcome her home.
mà bên mà tôi nó bên không bên đi nó bên đây đi ba tâm nhà đây đi à đi ba đây bên đó rồi ya cái nung muda buah gini ambil mampir saya mulia beda oh nuta buah muda ini ale kita kan datang sama orang dia boleh mampir saya
Monica's father and both of Joe Leo's grandparents were taken from the same beach on the same raid. To his astonishment, Joe discovers that the events of a single afternoon a century ago are still remembered on the island.
The story as we got it here in Pentecost, my grandfather and my grandmother and my wife's father was taken from Fuli down on the coast on the beach. They were having a big feast and the ship come in and then they just took them straight off the beach. And my grandfather, apparently he was in his teens. My wife's father was a very little boy, about 8 or 9 year old. And my grandmother, she was very young. She was only about 10 when they take him over to Australia.
My name is Pargosugi. A big ship came into the bay and men in a big boat came ashore. We had never seen such a big ship before. We thought they wanted coconuts and fruit for trade, so we brought them these things. They took us to the big ship saying, "Don't be afraid, you come have a look at ship." But they threw me down bottom of ship with plenty others. I was frightened. I began to cry. My mother and father and relations were left behind. Then they chased boys from other islands, tied them up hand and foot.
The one name where me harem time where me stop grow up. All fala refer long all get a ship sol se me say all boat long steely man. All boat blow steel. I know say me save say all white man we talk about activity or list up sing out say black birding. And only sing out say black birding where one name me talk here you me no save. But also, you miss Avetalem say one way been happening hemi Pacific slave trade.
Sugar planters and others. Henry Ross Lewin for years engaged in trade in the South Sea Islands, begs to inform the public of the arrival of the King Oscar. He will be happy to receive orders for the importation of Kanakas. Parties desirous of engaging labourers, please send in their order. Terms, £7 per man.
The first shipment of Pacific Islanders was landed at Red Bank near Brisbane in August 1863. In America, a bloody civil war was being fought over slavery.
Just as in America, African slaves were used to work and establish the cotton plantations in the south, just as in British colonies like Fiji, Indian coolies were brought in, so too in colonial Queensland we looked to Pacific Island labour to establish the sugar industry. Very few white Australians still understand that the Queensland sugar industry was based effectively upon slave labour.
Marlene Henaway is Joe Leo's younger sister. She's another grandchild of the boy who was plucked off the beach at Pentecost a century ago. Thousands of the descendants of those reluctant pioneers still live in the little North Queensland towns which grew up with the sugar industry. Marlene remembers her grandfather well, the old man she knew as Poppy.
Poppy came from a village in Pentecost, from Pentecost Island. He was only 12 years old at the time, 12, 13-year-old. So you can imagine the traumatic experience that he would have went through. They were brought over here to a northern port and then they were made to work in the sugar fields. Okay, have a look for a cross. Can you find me a cross? When they first came out here, they were given one set of clothing, and that was it. They had to work side by side clearing paddocks so that the big farmers can get their cane into the ground. So they're basically used as machinery as well, not just coming to cut the cane.
Mi blong epi island. Mino sabe long wane miaro le kisimi golong makai. Mino sabe Hamas Christmas mi gbeniga tasol mi man pinis. Master, he give me 1 plus sarap na mi to. Go katim sugar long hap. I get 1 plamani sabe was long mi pla nem blong em overseer. Sampla time this pla overseer I get big pla cross long olgata boy. I me fight him now, whip him olgata. Tommy Lamon Makai.
The Pacific Islanders weren't technically slaves. They were paid for their labour. But at about 1/5 the rate the planters would have had to pay white workers. If that is, in a colony where labour was desperately short, they could have found any Europeans willing to sweat it out on the cane fields.
In the 19th century, Europeans were fairly firmly convinced that they weren't capable of labouring hard in the tropics. They thought they would die, as one source said, from premature rack and decay, so that they were firmly convinced that they needed a coloured labour force. And as those plantations developed, Queensland prospered. Queensland could not have developed as quickly as it did in the 19th century without the use of cheap Melanesian labour. There was no other way that it could have been done.
Noah Sabo is a second-generation Australian South Sea Islander. Now 74, he can remember the stories about life on the early plantations told to him by his grandfather, one of the very first islanders transported to Queensland back in 1863.
This is the old Lindaroo plantation, and this is where the Kanakas worked, and when they came here. And this old Nindaroo, they say it had a good few people working here in its heyday, you know. They had to do their work properly, you know. You had to go out and chip cane or cut cane or thrash cane. You had to do it properly. If you didn't do it properly, well, the overseer, he always had a big boot on, and he would, of course, he used to ride a horse too, and it didn't take him many minutes to get off the horse and give them a good taste of his boot, so that all the work was done properly. They couldn't slum up their work, but it was hard on the plantations.
Phyllis Corowa lives comfortably enough today. She is the oldest of 10 children. Their father, Moses Anaris, was kidnapped in the 1890s from Tanna, another tiny island in Vanuatu. Phyllis's maternal grandmother was brought to Bundaberg as a young girl, but whether she was enticed to come or was simply grabbed by force, family tradition no longer tells.
They did bring women out, but not a lot. My mother's mother was brought out from Ober Island, and I think my grandmother was very young. I have seen photos of her chipping cane, like the cane is already grown. Chipping cane with men and an overseer standing in the rows watching them, see that they were doing the work right. My grandmother never liked to talk about it. Now that I'm able to piece all these things together, I feel that she was missing her family life and the island that she had left.
Me come from Oba Island. Nemblomi hem mati telavus. When me come to this country, Mrs. and Master calling me Elizabeth Oba. Me house girl and me clean him house belong Mrs. and Master. Me play with them pikinini belong Master and me sing him island songs from my home. Sometime when I finish housework, Mrs. say, "You now go clear him bush. You now go clear him ground. For Master, me dig him tree and plant him plenty sugar cane."
However hard the life in the cane fields, there was little the islanders could do about it. In the rest of Australia, white workers were organising. Trades unions were being formed. The working class was becoming one of the wealthiest in the world. But on the sugar plantations, Melanesian labourers were forbidden by law to strike for better wages or conditions, or to desert their employment. The penalty for absconding was 3 months' imprisonment. Right from the start, the so-called Queensland labour system was a subject of fierce controversy in Australia.
Kidnapping, slave trade and slavery are ugly words to
We
use.
have no hesitation in denouncing the trade in human beings.
Do we
as
want a
violation.
sugar industry in this country, or do we not?
Are we to accept slavery in Queensland when our brothers in America have shed their blood to end
If the
it?
government wants regulation, let them pay for it. One thing's certain, without the nigger, we wouldn't have an industry at all. Mackay Mercury.
There was considerable pressure for total abolition of the Pacific Islander trade that especially came from Melbourne and from Sydney. So you have a situation rather like how the American North denounced the slave-owning South. So here in Australia you have the Australian South denouncing rather contemptuously the slave-owning north of Australia and especially of Queensland.
An act to regulate and control the introduction and treatment of Pacific labourers, March 4, 1868.
Eventually, a reluctant Queensland Parliament was forced by public pressure to make some attempt to control the labour trade. Although dominated by pastoralists and plantation owners, it passed an act in 1868 which required employers to provide Melanesian labourers with food and clothing and a wage of £6 per year. The maximum length of a labour contract was 3 years, and the employer was responsible for paying the islanders' fare home. But even in far-off London, the trade had become notorious. Slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire back in 1833. To many in Britain, the Queensland system of indentured labour was just slavery by another name. The most scandalous stories to reach British ears came not from the plantations in Queensland, but from the islands. In 1872, the British Parliament passed the Kidnapping Act to try to stop the forcible abduction of islanders by unscrupulous traders. Kidnapping was not entirely stamped out, but after that most traders relied more on persuasion and less on brute force. Exactly what the islanders were told about Australia, it's impossible to know, but thousands were induced to sign on.
Islanders knew that they could go to Queensland for 3 years, work on a plantation or farm, in that time collect what was to them a substantial amount of European goods, axes, knives, guns, and that's really why they participated so willingly in the last 20 years or so of the labour trade.
Even after a single 3-year contract, the path back to the simple life of the villages was seldom easy. And the longer the islanders stayed in Australia, the wider grew the cultural gulf that separated them from the world they had left. Monica Leo has been estranged from her own people's language and custom by a century of separation.
Tamamwa misal memea mambaba hogosin tamam meme mambaba ratahin mua ratahiko ulia omai omabedumia omagom silomleao inao tamam.
Last year we came over to Pentecost Island and hoping to find our relatives then, but we couldn't find anyone, so we sort of made a few contacts and then went back home to Australia and decided to come back again this year to to come and try and find out where our relatives were, and this is why we're here today. We found them and very grateful.
The discovery that their chief had a first cousin living in Queensland, Australia, came as a complete surprise to the villagers of Lagotoa. They had never known what had happened to the relatives who disappeared so mysteriously in the Blackbirders' ships. There was even a legend in the village that they'd been taken to a neighbouring island and eaten by their traditional enemies.
Let me help you.
Monica pe ramen himameira be lolbila meute be rarumen gitai be kunhanige tamara no mai wanu tomo lorovoga teti. Malorovoga vai votu la maram leia ram le surainia kamai ram do la builoite. Kami mai be la rumen kita mule ute be tamara no lorovoga ia. Nuri bilan damu ia, nuri bilan manioko ia, bilan kumara. Hulihan no kim leila be lo autonomiu. Kabro mo hantay. Kina tamara be ram leia ba no kamara mulenga. Inaw selu iniliu nam lenga ilon matan. Mula mua.
Joe Leo's grandfather had come from another village, higher up the mountainside. But the path to it has been little used for the best part of 90 years. The village was abandoned at the turn of the century. According to old Chief Aru, the Blackbirders' raids were to blame. It's a story that was repeated all over the islands of Vanuatu.
Before, like Berdik Ololfala, it been stop story about planned place where villages have been stop long time before, populations have been big one to mass. But a lot of time when me fala stop grow up, every place here is bush, you know, Katman. White man, it been make him say population blow you me, ikolosapi wipe out.
By the 1890s, more than 50,000 people from dozens of Pacific islands had been transported to Queensland on 3-year contracts. Most then returned to the islands, but some decided to stay. Segregated from the European settlers, they brought their islander culture to the creeks and gullies on the outskirts of the sugar towns.
Being an agricultural people, these Kanakas, they tried to have the habitat they had over there, they tried to revive it over here, working the soil, planting the gardens, and it doesn't become old with them, you know, it doesn't become old hat with them. Every day they'll be there. The Kanakas, they lived all along here. They caught fish in this creek here and fish out there in the salt pan. And too, they had these big fig trees here. And they had the coconut trees too along here. So it reminded them of where they came from, the habitat. And this is why they like to come here, you know.
But gradually the pull of the islands would weaken. As the decades passed, the songs they sang, the clothes they wore, the very way they thought came more from the world they lived in and less from the world they'd left.
Let's go, short pass, quick pass, come on, toss around. Okay, come right back. Okay, switch it around to the corners now, all in the one move.
I used to take great delight in saying to my friends that I'm the grandson of a cannibal, and I used to play little jokes on them, such telling them my grandfather ate people and the kids used to run and scatter.
Quick ball, lady. Oh, back to him, Jamie.
Des Egmalesi's grandfather arrived in Bundaberg from Santo Island in 1887. It would be 6 years before he saw his island again.
Turn it over, mate, quick, turn it over. Good rolling, Jeffrey.
Grandfather Egmalis completed his 3-year term, and for reasons unknown only to himself, he agreed on another 3 years. Then he went back to Santo, all geared up in his hobnail boots and straw hat, felt hat, and fully clothed, as opposed to when he left in a loincloth and nothing else.
Jesus
Perhaps Grandpa Egmalesi's hobnail boots trod on too many toes on Santo. Within a year or two, he was sailing back to Bundaberg.
After he returned the second time to Bundaberg, he married my grandmother, and they worked together in Bundaberg and then went on to Nambour. My grandfather and my grandmother were never able to go back to the islands after they got married, Addie, because they'd both come from different islands, and it was frowned upon very much in those days. In fact, it probably led to death marrying somebody from another island.
By the 1890s, the town of Bundaberg had grown rich on the proceeds of the sugar trade. It's still a wealthy town today. From the mills and distilleries on the edge of town, sugar and rum flows out, and the money flows back in. In Bundaberg Cemetery, grandiose memorials to the old planter families stretch in well-kept rows. But no marble angels stand over the graves of the men and women on whose back-breaking toil the sugar trade was founded.
That's enough my work. I'm an office worker, really.
Hard labour and too much of it. Bad food and too little of it. Diseases to which they had no immunity. All these cost thousands of islander lives. The death rate was 4 times the European average. Their bodies were buried out of sight, as their sufferings have been largely out of mind.
Okay, where we are now, and where the boys are working behind me, is what we still call, and what they called in the early days the Kanaka Cemetery, which was also known as the Heathen Cemetery, which is probably 200 yards away from the cemetery that Europeans used, and there's approximately 400 buried here. Some of these sugar plantations, some of these farms, there are Kanaka graves unmarked. They were buried where they died in the paddock. At least this here is, it might have been regarded as a Kanaka cemetery or a heathen cemetery, but at least they're here. As opposed to where they were up in the bush and everywhere and all around, higgledy-piggledy around the place. So with the help of these all my nephews and cousins and relations here that are doing a tremendous job, this here will eventually be restored into something to what we would like it, to what they deserve in the 90s. What should have been done in the 100 years ago, in their 1890s, you know.
Where the supervisors?
Kenny, reckon this is the same spot you sat last time?
Yeah, it is.
Try to get up and do some work.
We're women, we're not men.
Hey. So she's bringing me back Thursday. Gee.
Even though we make a joke when we're working, it's sad really. But it's an old saying that we got between us, we laugh to stop ourselves from crying. And that's true. Well.
Most of the islanders who chose to stay in Australia made efforts to assimilate to their new land. They became ardent Christian converts. They adopted European manners and no longer spoke their native tongues. But as the turn of the century approached, the Kanakas became not more but even less acceptable to most white Australians. The depression of the 1890s had brought widespread unemployment, which fanned the smouldering racism of the working class.
This cancer of alien-coloured labour has been allowed to eat into our country for far too long already.
Naturally weak constitution. This is the Kanaka's great secret.
And no white woman is safe alone in a Kanaka
He doesn't
district.
die altogether.
For
He
these
remains
brutes can
half
never be
dead and
trusted.
quite submissive. He is priceless to the planter because he's preeminently kickable. The Bulletin, 1892.
From the early 1890s, it was the white labour movement that took up the cudgels most energetically in terms of the abolition of the Pacific Islander labour trade. The opposition was primarily economic, fearing that workers' wages would be undercut, but also was part of a much wider image of Australia and the labouring classes as this being a land for white men, unfortunately, but this being a land for white people. And I suppose this is best exemplified in the labour press, in magazines like The Worker and The Boomerang, so that Melanesians were portrayed as savages, untamable savages, especially sexually. So the threat that the Pacific Islander labourers posed to European women was dwelt upon. The Kanaka was portrayed as taking away not just wealth, but white women as well.
Mr. Speaker, I have been strongly affected by the ideal of a white Australia and by the hope of being able to keep away from our shores forever.
In the jubilant atmosphere of federation, the call for a white Australia swept through all the former colonies. One of the first pieces of legislation passed by the new federal parliament in 1901 was the Immigration Restriction Act, which effectively banned all non-white immigration. In the same year, Parliament was presented with a bill to put a stop to the Queensland labour trade. The sugar planters fought a stubborn rearguard action.
Responsible men in Queensland are talking seriously of resorting to civil war.
See the miserable pittance, and who are dealt with very much in the same way as slaves.
The death of the sugar industry and will create a bitter feeling against federation and
the planters lost, and the act was passed. No Melanesian labourer could be recruited after 1904. And 2 years later, the Act laid down, Pacific Islanders already in Australia were to be forcibly deported.
I come to Queensland long time ago. I have wife and plenty children here. We are good Christian people. Tanaka like me build white fellow sugar business. Now white man no more wants black man. He's used him up altogether and chasing him away. He say to Kanaka, clear out, this country belong a white man. These boys no come here by own free will. Ship come to their island, make fools of them and fetch them here, and now when they find Jesus and get civilized, they are deported. Tanna, North Queensland.
The islanders themselves fought to remain in Queensland, and they came together in a political organisation and fought back quite successfully with petitions and with deputations to say that they had a right to stay in Australia. It was outrageous to deport these people who had become Christian, settled Queenslanders with families, and to send them back to their own islands could mean their deaths.
The cries of protest from the cane fields were eventually heard in Brisbane. 6 months before the deportation was due to take place, the Queensland government appointed a royal commission. On its recommendation, the federal government agreed that old people, islanders married to Aborigines or Europeans, and those who'd been living in Queensland for more than 20 years could stay. All the others, around 4,000, would have to leave.
There are families in Australia today that were split apart. Some brothers and sisters perhaps went back with father to the islands, some children remained with mother in Australia. The scenes on the wharves were traumatic, full of anguish. Children, brothers and sisters, never saw the other sides of their families again once they sailed off on the boats.
But Joe Leo's grandfather never came back to Pentecost. By the time of deportation, he was married and settled in Bundaberg and was allowed to stay. Monica's father was another of the few who managed to remain in Australia. Until her unexpected return, the people of Lavatoa had heard nothing about her father and had gradually forgotten all about him. Noah Sabo's grandparents had been in Queensland for over 20 years. They were one of only 27 families in Mackay exempted from the deportation order. Des Egmolesi's granddad Negus was another who was allowed to stay, though they did try to deport his brother. But great-uncle Tom jumped ship, swam back to shore, and successfully went into hiding. Phyllis Corowa's father managed to escape by walking south.
My father didn't want to go back then to the islands, and he ran away to Sydney. And he walked. Took him many, many days to walk to Sydney along the beach. A white lady had a boarding house in Sydney. She used to take in all the islanders, and she hid him. And he said all he was doing was staying in the kitchen and washing up. He did say that he stayed many months in Sydney, and then he got enough money to come back up here to Queensland again. He really wanted to work here in Australia. He said you could make plenty of money here, but it didn't happen that way.
The sweetest story ever told. Here is the Australian version of it. I wonder if you knew that Australia is the only country in the world where cane sugar is produced and manufactured by white labour under white man's conditions and rates of pay. Splendid specimens these, typical sun-tanned Australian manhood at its best, and the cane they cut is taller than themselves. North Queensland has shown that the white man can thrive on hard work in the tropics. The Australian sugar industry...
After deportation, the Australian Workers' Union launched a crusade to turn the sugar industry into a whites-only preserve. Farmers who used only European labour received a bounty from the federal government. And in 1919, as soldiers returned from the Great War looking for work, Melanesians were excluded by law from working on European farms.
Some of the farmers were lenient towards a lot of the islanders because they were good workers, and they used to give them work of a night time. They used to go out and chip cane of a night time and cut the cane of a night time. My grandmother used to say that she used to go out night time and chip cane. That was a way that they could work illegally to survive, really.
Less than 2,000 islanders had managed to avoid being deported. But ironically, to stay in Australia, most had to return to an island way of life.
being abandoned from the cane industry. My grandparents settled in a little settlement of Joscalee. They survived on growing gardens and living out of the sea, fish and crabs and prawns and from the bush. And so Grandma and Granddad just grew their family up in just a simple house with dirt floor, hessian bags for walls. And I think the input that they put into their children was mostly to value families, not material things. And this is basically what I think our old South Sea Island people put into each and every one of us as their descendants, that the value of family is much more precious than the value of money.
This is just a great bit of play down.
We, as kids, used to go out to the camps where all the old single South Sea Islanders used to live, and they were all the same. They used to talk in broken English to us and talk to us and give us money. It's the part we liked anyway. And I can recall, like as if it was now, their little gardens. They'd have their little picket fence gardens, and they made gardens out of nothing. And they lived in little groups here and there everywhere. Grandfather Nags was quite adamant. He used to say, no, you're here in Australia now. You don't want to know anything about the islands. You're never going to go back there and live. And you learn the Australian way.
Events in Europe prove that every man is needed. So here they come, answering the call. Men from every walk of life.
And then once more the wheel turned, and Australia needed the islanders again. As thousands of Australians joined up to fight Hitler, the sugar farms lost their white field hands, and the Melanesians were called back to cut the cane. That was when Noah Sabo learned the skills of the cane cutter, from men 30 years older than himself.
All our old men, our uncles and that, they went back cutting cane. See, they knew how to cut it. And I tell you, they could work. And I remember going out with them, they said, oh, boy, you come tomorrow, we cut cane. Oh, yeah. And I thought, well, I'll give it to these old fellas. But I tell you, at the end of the day, they had to nearly carry me home.
And now, in the 1990s, the tiny nucleus which avoided deportation has grown into a community some 20,000 strong. Through decades of poverty and exclusion, islanders have married islanders, their close-knit families a shield against the outside world.
Smile, everybody.
Okay.
Jason Smith is trying to. Kenny
Gradually, in recent years, the barriers have been coming down. In sport especially, islanders, like Aboriginal people, have found a path to success and recognition. Kenny Negus of the Canberra Raiders is Des Egmalesi's nephew. And his former captain Mal Meninga is one of their own as well. But how many football fans would know who the South Sea Islanders are, or how they came to Australia?
When I met Desi, I didn't even realise there was a different race to Aboriginals. I couldn't recognise them as different.
And that's the case of a lot of people.
And I think that's very common. As I became more involved with the family, I was really amazed. Originally, I'm talking about 25 years ago, they would still talk about white people being nice to them, and that white person treated me just like I was a white person. Of course, this just absolutely horrified me.
One way or another, the descendants of those Pacific Island sugar workers have found a place for themselves in Australia. Their families have been in Queensland for longer than all but a handful of Queenslanders. But gaining acceptance has never been easy.
Pardon? That's a good one again.
too heavy. It is strange how people come up often and say to me, "Do you like living out here?" And I say, "Well, I should do. I was born right here." And I tell them I'm an Australian born, and they look at me wide-eyed. And I said, "And you want to know where my parents come from? They come from Vanuatu." Both Les and I...
In 1994, the Australian government formally recognised the Pacific Islanders as a distinct ethnic community, the only substantial black migrant group in Australia.
One each way now, one each way.
But Des Aigmeless, for one, still isn't satisfied that justice has been done to his people.
Well, a lot of people have asked me, you know, what am I missing out on in the world today? Well, I'm not missing out on bugger all, really. But what I want is recognition for my people, for the work in which they did early in establishing the cane industry, the recognition for their blood, sweat and tears. I'm proud to be called a Kanaka, and I'm proud to be a direct descendant of the old people who were brought out here. We believe is slavery. I believe is slavery, for the want of better wording. I'm proud to be called a Kanaka. I always will be.
Ron, do you want another couple of burnt snags or half-burnt snags or what off?
The Kanaka's sweated labour laid one of the foundations for Australia's prosperity, which at last Australian islanders are just beginning to share. But like most people in this nation of immigrants, the islanders are finding that to be confident of who they are, they need to understand where they came from. More and more of them these days are making the journey to find out. For the Leo family, the visit to Pentecost was more overwhelming than they'd expected. They rediscovered their roots in an island culture thousands of years old. But they had to come to terms with the fact that though they could attempt to understand it, they could no longer possibly belong.
Kaya nung binimbe ni akamay lusi ang bibi nung binimbe may mulu fight habang banua ano sali nemra may baten bin mavang na mulo belamdo na binimbe may mamuli.
When you say to come over here and live, it's a hard decision because I got my home back in Australia.
One week later, in the land which his grandfather had helped to clear with nothing but muscle power and machetes, Joe Leo was back at work. He and Monica are still trying to come to terms with what they found out on Pentecost. About their origins, their island culture, the history of their families, and about themselves.
Them ships there now, they symbolise taken away in the boats, in the Black Virgin days, that's what they... And that's what that dance is all about. Yeah, well, one of the main things I think in our lives that I found out for the first time this year was Monica's father, Charlie Malamud, was related to my grandfather.
We really found out that we were supposed to be cousins, very distant cousins, I hope. Known each other all our lives, we didn't even know we were related.
But it's a sad thing, eh? You know, when you don't really know what you are, eh? Or who you are, eh? And that's what it's all boiled down to. You know, when you say we're trying to dig up our past, trying to find out where we come from, and you're getting all these other things out of coming out the woodwork that you didn't realise. Yeah.
Maybe had we known this, we may not have got married.
Like cut there.
An ancient chant, an exhortation to summon the spirits. Above him the gods, below 20 metres of thin air, and then the ground. Vanuatu and the coast of Pentecost Island, the home of an age-old custom more daring and spectacular than any other. Since the island was first sighted by Europeans, little has changed. But over the next 12 months, the people of Pentecost could experience more change than they've seen over the last 200 years. On a hill above the village, a tower of tradition that's becoming a beacon for 20th century tourists. The structure is a feat of ancient engineering. No nails, no wire, just wood and vines. And an architectural precision passed down through the centuries. When the missionaries first landed on Pentecost about 150 years ago, they tried to ban land diving as a pagan practice. It almost disappeared entirely, but one village, Bunlap, defiantly resisted Christianity and continued the custom. From there, the towers have sprung up again in almost all the villages on the island. But the modern world is closing in. The littlest land diver has a maths lesson. 8-year-old John uses more traditional methods of calculation in the jungle with older brother Willie. The day before the jump, they select the vines that'll break John's fall from the tower. The longest and strongest vines are for the chief's son. From the top of the tower, Reginald has the supreme honour of making the final dive.
We search for a good vine which is able to hold up the weight of a person who jumps. Like this one here is a good size for me.
Young men come from neighbouring villages by sea and by land to prepare for Ngol, the land dive. At the tower, Willie builds the platform John will leap from.
John will one put the tool take here, stand on this.
So he puts his feet on those there,
yeah.
On there, and that's where he falls off.
Yes.
From there. The structure of the platform is a marvel of primitive engineering. The technology's been handed down for generations. Does it make you a man if you do this?
No, it doesn't make you a man, but it's just like a sport. But it's something that if someone tries to jump, then it makes him feels like jumping all the time. He don't want to miss any jump.
The length of the vines is crucial. And that's where this man comes in. They call him the doctor. With the glass, he gauges size and stature. The vine is cut so the diver's head will theoretically lightly touch the earth. The vines are shredded at the end, then wrapped in leaves to keep them moist overnight until they're tied around the diver's ankles. It's the rainy season, the time of yam harvest, the time of ngol. A good growing season means good vines for diving, which means a bountiful yam harvest. The roots of the ritual lie in an old legend. Chief Malsari Dal tells the tale of a young woman who ran away from her husband. When he gave chase, she climbed a coconut tree.
She
tear the young shoot into two pieces and tie the other one to her ankle. And then when she saw the boy climbing ready to catch her, then she jumped. And then she sprang to the coconut palm and stayed there while the boy wanted to jump for her to catch her. He missed the lady and came down and he died.
In the early days, it was the women who dived, but male pride took over, and now the tower is off limits to women. As the day of the diving dawns, the slope is loosened and softened for the landings. And so it begins. First up, John, calm and unconcerned as he contemplates diving from the height of a two-storied building. He carries with him feathers, symbols of his ancestors. But then he's on his own. John's dive is witnessed by A.J. Hackett, the man who developed and perfected the modern bungee. A.J. is the guru of bungee jumping. He says, at least from where he sits, the jolt of the land dive is not as severe as it seems.
Probably looks a lot stronger than what it actually is, because you see that at the top of the tower how the little platform breaks away, then they actually spring back, so there's some movement in the vine also. I think it's probably reasonably comfortable. That's why these guys are able to get up and walk up and dance and carry on.
It's very dangerous.
People get hurt.
Sometimes people get hit, but sometimes people don't get hit.
Sometimes people die?
Once in 1972, when the Queen came over there to Behomo, one man died. But since then, no one died till now.
some, the moment of triumph becomes a day of pain. In his exhilaration, he doesn't realise he may have broken his ankle. But help is at hand in the form of the bush ambulance. Some primeval physiotherapy brings more suffering with little sympathy from onlookers. It's heart-stopping performances like this that have caught the attention of international tourist operators. While we were here, Club Med were in the next village negotiating to bring in a cruise liner for next year's Ngol.
I've heard about these people for a long time, but it's the first time I've been able to get across and see them, so it's just great.
Did what they were doing, or what they've been doing for centuries, did that have anything to do with what you started off?
Yeah, well, these people are the original bungee jumpers, if you like, or they're the inspiration for the modern-day bungee jumper on elastic, you know.
The land dive is the domain of the male, but wearing only the nambas or penis sheath, they seem more likely to lose their manhood rather than prove it. A dislodged nambas, and pride is bruised more than muscles. What do you think of when you get up there and you stand on the end of this platform? What goes through your mind?
The thing that goes through my mind is that I just put my trust on the vines that are tied to my legs, because those vines will hold me. I cannot be head on the ground.
Legend has it the tower is the home of a spirit, but the structure also has human features.
This land area is represent body of a man. The head, the shoulder, the neck, and the shoulder.
There's at least 2 people looking after each guy that jumps. The same with us, so the jumper's not relying on everything himself. There's always someone to look after him. And obviously a lot of thought's gone into the whole design and engineering of the whole structure, you know, and so it's just great. But the real thing is they're into accuracy, and that's what we're into, you know, like they come down and all of them touch the ground, which is just great.
Time may be running out for the people of Pentecost. If their gods are angered by changes to the ritual and the presence of camera-toting tourists, they may desert the divers who clap for their attention. This is dangerous, Reginald. This is dangerous. Why do you do it?
Even if we didn't do it for money, we still do it because it's our custom. Every time we harvest yam, we must do some jumps.
How dangerous is it, do you think?
I think if these guys continue to do it in the way they've done it for a long time, I don't think it's dangerous at all. But as soon as they start to change the reason why they're doing it, then I think it could be very dangerous, you know.
Are you afraid you might die?
Yes, of course.
These could be the last of the land divers, at least the truly traditional ones. But whatever lies ahead for them, it'll always come down to that one moment of truth, when, with or without his gods, the diver stands alone on the edge of his platform.
Coming up, when the Iron Curtain lifted, it exposed what was the Soviet Union to the West, and not only the good, but also the bad. Drugs are becoming the modern-day plague of Russia. That's next on 2020.